On the afternoon of March 14th, 1960, three women from the Chicago suburbs set out on what was supposed to be a relaxing 4-day getaway to Starved Rock State Park in Illinois. Mildred Lindquist, 50, Lillian Oetting, 50, and Francis Murphy, 47, were all close friends, married to prominent businessmen, and active members of the Riverside Presbyterian Church. They had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, especially Lillian, who had spent the previous months caring for her husband after he suffered a heart attack. The women made the 90-mile drive from their homes in Riverside to Starved Rock Lodge, located in Oglesby, Illinois. Upon arrival, they checked into their two rooms, unpacked their luggage, and had lunch in the dining room. The weather was pleasant with a light dusting of snow on the ground, so they decided to take advantage of the beautiful scenery and go for a short hike. As they walked along the trails, admiring the steep rocky walls and frozen waterfalls, they had no idea that this peaceful afternoon would be their last. They eventually reached the dead end of St. Louis Canyon, about a mile from the lodge. Lillian took several photos of the canyon using Francis's camera, capturing what would tragically become their final moments together. That evening, Lillian's husband, George, tried to call her at the lodge, as she had promised to check in. When he couldn't reach her, a staff member assured him that she was likely just away from her room and suggested she would call back in the morning. George, eager to hear about their trip, decided to wait patiently for her call. Well, the next morning, George called the lodge again. This time, the receptionist mistakenly informed him that the three women had been seen at breakfast and were simply out at the moment. The receptionist offered to leave a message for Lillian to call him back. Unbeknownst to everyone at the time, this misinformation would prove to be a crucial error in the timeline of events. As Tuesday night fell, a winter storm hit the area, blanketing the park in several inches of snow. George's concern grew when he still couldn't reach Lillian. He decided to contact the other husbands, only to discover that they too hadn't heard from their wives since they left Chicago on March 14th. Alarmed by this development, the men agreed to call the lodge again the following morning. On Wednesday, George made yet another call to the lodge. This time, at his insistence, employees entered the women's rooms. They found the beds unmade and the women's belongings still there. Their car was also in the parking lot, indicating they hadn't left the premises. The gravity of the situation began to sink in. Realizing something was terribly wrong, George reached out to his longtime friend, Virgil W. Peterson, the operating director of the Chicago Crime Commission. Peterson immediately contacted state police and other law enforcement agencies in the area, including the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Ray Utsi wasted no time in organizing search parties to scour the park for any sign of the missing women. And on March 16th, as the search for the three women intensified, a group of young men from a nearby youth camp set out on the snow-covered trails of Starved Rock State Park. The weather had deteriorated over the past 2 days, making their task even more challenging as they navigated the narrow, icy pathways. Shortly after the search began, the group made a horrifying discovery in an area of the park known as St. Louis Canyon, about half a mile away from Starved Rock Lodge. There, tucked in a cave, they found the bodies of three women. The victims had been brutally beaten, their skulls smashed in with what appeared to be a blunt object, and trails of blood stained the ground and snow around the bodies, painting a grim picture of their final moments. Chief William Morris immediately called investigators from the Illinois Bureau of Investigations to process the crime scene and determine if any of the victims had been sexually assaulted. The evidence suggested that they had been. The entire canyon, except for the floor of the overhang where the bodies were found, was covered in nearly 6 inches of snow. This presented a significant challenge for the investigators, who had to use flamethrowers and brooms to clear the area. potentially damaging crucial evidence in the process. The scene that greeted the investigators was gruesome. The three women were found lying side by side, partially covered with snow and blood. Mildred and Lillian had been stripped of their pants and underwear, their clothing torn in several places. Their coats had been placed between their legs, and all three women had their legs spread open. Each victim had been viciously beaten about the head, and two of the bodies were tied together with heavy white twine. Frances appeared to have been bound in the same manner, but the twine around her ankles had come undone. A trail of blood leading from the bodies indicated that they had been dragged and positioned under the rock ledge. As investigators combed the area for evidence, they recovered several key items. A pair of binoculars covered in blood was found near the bodies. Frances Murphy's Argus C3 camera was discovered about 10 feet away, its leather strap broken and case smeared with blood. The condition of the camera suggested a violent struggle had taken place. When the film from her camera was later developed, it provided a chilling glimpse into the women's final hours. Most of the images showed them posing in front of various waterfalls and rock formations in the canyons. The last picture on the roll was a triple exposure, meaning that the camera's knob hadn't been rotated before taking the photo. This final image showed Frances and Mildred standing in front of a frozen waterfall, overlaid onto another frame of film taken at a location close to where their bodies were found. As the investigation continued, LaSalle County's state's attorney Harland Warren made a crucial discovery a short distance from the bodies. He came across a frozen 3-foot tree limb streaked with blood, with the snow beneath it also covered in blood. And nearby, they found a long icicle from the cave, also bearing traces of blood. The detective quickly realized these were likely the murder weapons, and so Chief William Morris shared his initial thoughts with the reporters, stating that he believed it would have been extremely difficult for one person to overpower and kill all three women, who had clearly put up a fight, mind you. If it was indeed a single perpetrator, Morris speculated it must have been a man strong enough to overcome three victims simultaneously. This theory was supported by the fact that Mildred, Lillian, and Frances were fit for their age and not frail women. The state police had their own theory about the crime scene. Although there was blood found inside the cave and on its walls, the amount was less than what would be expected if the cave had been the primary site of the murders. They hypothesized that the killer may have murdered the women in a clearing somewhere else in the woods, left them there, and then returned later to drag their bodies into the cave, possibly to conceal them from immediate discovery. The bodies were transported to the Hulse Funeral Home in Ottawa for examination and autopsy. The coroner confirmed that the women had been sexually assaulted, but found no evidence of rape. They were able to determine the time of death, placing it shortly after the women had lunch at the lodge on March 14th. As the investigation progressed, they quickly dismissed robbery as a motive for the murders. The women had left most of their valuables behind in their rooms when they went for their afternoon hike, and their rings and other personal possessions were still on their bodies when they were found. Harlan Warren took charge of the investigation, but the state police maintained their authority in the case because the murders were committed on park property. The LaSalle County Sheriff's Office, lacking proper experience with crimes of this magnitude, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Early on in the investigation, a set of keys was found on the trail leading to the cave, and there was a reported sighting of a gray station wagon in the area where the women entered the park shortly before they were believed to have been killed. However, these potential leads ultimately went nowhere. The continued media coverage of the case kept the pressure on the police officials to make progress. Virgil Peterson, who worked for the Chicago Crime Commission and was close friends with all three victims' families, criticized the county sheriff's office for not organizing a search sooner. he pointed out that 2 days had passed with no sign of the women before any effort was made to find them, despite multiple unanswered calls from their husbands. As time began to pass, resources dedicated to solving the murders began to strain the budget. The total man-hours put into the case was approaching 22,000, with a cost of around 65 grand. With funds drying up, the hope of solving the murders seemed to be slipping away. In a desperate attempt to find any new leads, Harlan Warren used his own money to purchase a microscope and began studying the twine used to bind the women. His examination revealed that 2 types of twine had been used, a 12-ply and a 20-ply cord. Deputies Bill Dummett and Wayne Hess began searching for the specific twine at the Starved Rock Lodge. In September of 1960, they discovered both types of twine in the lodge's kitchen where it was used for wrapping food. This discovery narrowed the focus of the investigation to someone who either worked or had access to the park's lodge kitchen area. The breakthrough in the case came when Warren hired a specialist from a prominent Chicago firm to conduct polygraph tests on all the employees who had worked during the week of the murders. On September 23, 1960, one by one the employees were called to a small cabin near the lodge for testing. And when former dishwasher Chester Otto Weger took the test, the examiner's reaction caught Warren's attention. As soon as Weger left the cabin, the technician turned to Warren and the deputies and said, "That's your man." Chester Weger, a 21-year-old married father of 2, had worked at the park until that summer when he resigned to go into a business with his father as a house painter. Deputy Dummett remembered Weger's name from an earlier police report, but investigators had not initially considered him a suspect. On March 15th, the day after the murders, Weger had shown up to work with his fresh scratches on his face, which he claimed were from accidentally cutting himself while shaving. Investigators asked Weger to provide a piece of his buckskin jacket for examination. The jacket had suspicious dark stains on it, which were later confirmed to be blood. However, whether it was animal or human blood would become a point of contention in subsequent events. And then, authorities discovered a connection to another crime. About 6 months before the Starved Rock murders, 2 high school seniors on a date in a nearby Matheson State Park had been robbed at gunpoint and tied up. The young woman had been sexually assaulted. When the victims initially reported the incident to the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office, deputies had dismissed their story as fiction. Now, with Weger as a suspect, the young female victim was shown pictures and quickly identified him as her assailant. Despite this positive identification, Warren waited to charge Weger, partly due to his impending re-election and concerns about being accused of making an arrest as a publicity stunt. Instead, Weger was placed under 24-hour surveillance throughout October of 1960. On November 16, 1960, after Warren had lost the election but before his replacement took office, police used the woman's positive ID from the Matheson State Park incident to arrest Weger for sexual assaults and robbery. Deputies Hess and Dummett were ordered to make the arrest with the belief that Weger would confess to both this crime and the Starved Rock murders. The interrogation of Weger lasted until past midnight. Fatigued by the questioning, Weger asked to see his family. After a brief visit with his parents, Deputy Hess claimed that Weger confessed. The confession was transcribed and signed by Weger. The next day, Weger accompanied state police to St. Louis Canyon for a reenactment of the murders, witnessed by a large group of newspaper and radio reporters, and he provided a detailed account of the events, claiming he had initially intended to rob the women, but the situation escalated when they resisted. However, just 3 days after meeting with his court-appointed attorney, Weger changed his story. On November 19, 1960, he claimed innocence, stating that he had been in Oglesby at the time of the killings and had been coerced into confessing. He alleged that both deputies had threatened him with violence, causing him to sign the confession out of fear. Weger's trial then began on January 20th, 1961, presided over by Judge Leonard Hoffman, the new state's attorney. Robert E. Richardson led the prosecution, assisted by Anthony Reculia. They decided to charge Weger with only one of 3 murders, that of Lillian Oetting, to leave room for further charges in case of a mistrial or acquittal. The trial itself lasted 5 weeks, during which Weger maintained his innocence on the stand. The jury deliberated for nearly 10 hours before finding Chester Weger guilty of Lillian Oetting's murder on March 3, 1961. He was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after serving for 20 years. Over the following decades, Weger continued to maintain his innocence and made multiple attempts at appeals and parole. In 2004, his attorneys tried to have new DNA testing done on evidence items, but the judge ruled against it due to potential contamination of the evidence over the years. Now, on November 21st, 2019, after 24 requests, the Illinois Prisoner Review Board granted parole to Weger by a vote of 9-4, 58 years after his conviction. On February 21st, 2020, at the age of 80, Chester Weger was released from Pinckneyville Correctional Center. Upon his release, Weger maintained his innocence. The case continues to be a subject of debate, with some believing in Weger's guilt and others questioning the evidence and circumstances surrounding his conviction. The Starved Rock murders remain one of Illinois' most famous and controversial criminal cases to this day. Because you guys made it to the end, leave a comment below, innocent or guilty, so I know who watched the whole video. If you guys are fans of unsolved mysteries like today's episode, hit that like and subscribe button for videos just like this one. Remember folks, never stop searching for the truth.